Inteus heard the crying before he saw her, a sound so faint it could have been the wind through canyon rocks. But wind doesn't sob. Wind doesn't gasp for breath between wails. He stopped his horse on the narrow trail, one hand moving instinctively to the rifle across his saddle, and listened. The high desert of southern Oregon stretched around him in all directions, sagebrush and dust, a land that swallowed the weak and forgot the dead. The crying came again, sharper now, desperate. He nudged his horse forward, following the sound, to where the trail bent around a cluster of juniper trees. And that's when he saw her, a little girl no more than 5 years old, sitting in the dirt beside an overturned supply cart. Her face buried in her hands, her dress torn and filthy. Blood stained the ground near the cart. Fresh blood. Bodies of a man and woman lay sprawled in the sun, already drawing flies. Inteus dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on gravel, and the girl's head snapped up. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto his. She didn't scream. She just stared, frozen, as if deciding whether he was salvation or the next thing that would hurt her. Inteus raised one hand, palm out, the universal gesture of peace, and spoke in a voice roughened by years of silence. "You're safe with me." The girl didn't move. Her small body trembled. Dirt streaked across her tear-stained cheeks, and her breathing came in shallow, panicked bursts. Inteus took another step forward, careful, measured, the way he'd approach a wounded animal. He'd learned long ago that fear could kill as surely as a bullet, and this child was drowning in it. He crouched low, making himself smaller, less threatening, and pointed to himself. "Inteus," he said. Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She didn't answer. Her lips quivered, but no words came. Inteus glanced past her at the wreckage, the overturned cart with its broken wheel, the scattered supplies, flour sacks torn open and spilling white powder across the red earth. The bodies, a man and a woman, lay where they'd fallen. The man's hand still clutched a revolver, but it hadn't saved him. Arrow wounds marked both bodies, Paiute arrows by the fletching, which meant this attack had happened recently, maybe within the last few hours. The raiders were likely long gone, but Inteus wasn't fool enough to assume safety. He scanned the horizon, eyes sharp for movement, for dust clouds, for anything that didn't belong in this desolate stretch of land. He moved to the bodies first, removed his hat, and closed their eyes. The woman's hand lay outstretched toward the girl, as if she'd been reaching for her daughter in her final moments. Inteus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of too many deaths witnessed, too many lives cut short by this unforgiving land. He'd seen this story before. Settlers pushing west, unprepared, unaware of the dangers, paying the price in blood. He whispered a prayer in Modoc, words his grandmother had taught him, words for the dead to find their way. The girl watched him from where she sat, her body still trembling, her eyes tracking every movement he made. When he finished the prayer, he turned back to her and approached again, this time extending his hand slowly. She flinched, pulling back like he'd raised a whip. He stopped immediately, waited, then slowly reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen. He unscrewed the cap, took a long drink himself to show it was safe, then held it out to her. The girl's eyes flickered to the water, then back to his face. Her tongue darted across cracked, dry lips. She'd been out here for hours, maybe since dawn, with no water, no shade, no help coming. Inteus set the canteen on the ground between them and stepped back, giving her space. She watched him for a long moment, her body coiled tight like she might bolt at any second, then suddenly lunged forward, grabbed the canteen and drank desperately. Water spilled down her chin and neck, soaking the collar of her torn dress. When she finally pulled the canteen away, gasping for air, she clutched it to her chest like a prize and retreated back to her spot by the cart. Inteus nodded, satisfied. At least she had enough survival instinct left to drink when offered. Some children he'd seen in shock wouldn't even do that much. "What's your name?" he asked again, softer this time, his voice barely above the whisper of wind through sagebrush. The girl's voice came out as barely a whisper, fragile as spun glass. "Kora, Kora," he repeated, letting the name settle between them. "That's a good name. Strong name." He glanced at the sun, already past its peak and starting its descent toward the western horizon. They had maybe 4 hours of daylight left, and this was no place to spend the night. The smell of death would draw scavengers, coyotes first, then maybe wolves or mountain lions, and he had no intention of fighting off predators in the dark with a terrified child to protect. He stood, walked to the cart and began sorting through what was salvageable. Most of the supplies were ruined or stolen. The raiders had taken anything of value, weapons, tools, food stores, but they'd missed a few things. He found a wool blanket, mostly clean, tucked under a broken crate. A small cloth doll lay half-buried in the dirt near the cart's back wheel, its face smudged but intact. He picked both up and brought them to Kora. She took the doll immediately, pressed it against her chest with both hands, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like relief crossed her face. A softness appeared in her eyes just for a moment before the fear returned. Intius wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, pulling it snug. She was shivering despite the heat of the day, her body in shock. "We need to go," he said gently. "Not safe here." Kora looked past him at the bodies, then back to his face. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "My mama, my papa." "I know," Intius said quietly, crouching so they were eye level. "I'm sorry. Are they coming back?" The question hit him harder than it should have. He'd heard it before from other children in other places, and it never got easier. He chose honesty over comfort because lies, even kind ones, had a way of breaking trust later. "No, they're not coming back." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilled over in hot streams down her dirt-stained cheeks, and she began to cry again. This time the sobs came with full force, body-shaking wails that echoed across the empty desert. Intius let her cry. He didn't try to stop it, didn't try to soothe it away with empty words. Grief had to be felt, had to run its course like a fever. He'd learned that the hard way after losing his own family, after watching his village burn, after burying his wife and infant son in ground that was too hard and too cold. He knew what it meant to carry loss. When Kora's sobs finally quieted into hiccups and shuddering breaths, Intius spoke again, his voice steady and calm. "I'm going to bury them. You can say goodbye if you want." He didn't wait for permission. He walked to his horse, retrieved a small folding shovel from his pack and began digging. The ground was hard, packed tight by years of sun and wind, but Intius had dug graves before. Too many graves. He worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal against earth and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, watching for carrion. The work took over an hour. By the time he finished, sweat soaked through his shirt and his shoulders ached, but the graves were ready, shallow but sufficient, deep enough to keep the scavengers at bay for a while. Kora watched from her spot by the cart the entire time, hugging her doll, the blanket draped over her thin shoulders like a cloak. When Intius lifted the woman's body first, Kora's face crumpled, but she didn't look away. He carried the woman gently, cradling her like she was sleeping, and laid her in the earth with as much dignity as he could manage. Then he did the same with the man, whose face was harder, weathered by sun and work, a farmer or tradesman probably. Intius found a wooden cross among the cart's wreckage, part of the supplies they'd been carrying west, and drove it into the ground at the head of the graves. He didn't know their names, so he carved nothing into the wood. Just the cross, a silent marker in an empty land where so many had died without Genian. Kora approached slowly, one small step at a time, and stood at the edge of the grave. She stared down at the shapes wrapped in whatever cloth Intius had found among the wreckage. Her voice was small, barely audible over the wind. "Mama said we were going to California. She said we'd have a house with a garden." Intius nodded, standing beside her with his hat in his hands. "I'm sure it would have been beautiful. She said I could pick flowers every day, roses and daisies and sunflowers. She loved you very much." "I can see that." Kora's face crumpled again, and she dropped to her knees in the dirt, pressed her small hand flat against the mound of earth covering her mother. "I don't want to leave them here." Intius crouched beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not leaving them. They're with you, always, in here." He tapped his chest over his heart. She looked up at him, searching his face for something, maybe truth, maybe hope, maybe just someone who wouldn't lie to her. Whatever she found in his weathered face and dark eyes, it was enough. She stood slowly, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and nodded. Inteus returned to his horse, checked the sun's position again, and made his decision. His usual camp was 10 miles north, too far to reach before dark, with a child who could barely walk from exhaustion. But there was a shallow cave he knew about, maybe 3 miles west, tucked into the base of a red rock mesa. It would provide shelter, concealment, and a defensible position if trouble came looking. He'd used it before when traveling through this territory. He walked back to Kora, knelt so they were eye level, and spoke clearly. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe tonight. You'll ride with me on my horse. Can you do that?" Kora nodded, clutching her doll tighter. Inteus lifted her easily. She weighed almost nothing, all bones and skin, and settled her in front of him on the saddle. She stiffened at first, her body rigid with fear and distrust, but when he wrapped one arm securely around her small frame to keep her steady, she relaxed slightly. He could feel her heartbeat through her thin dress, fast and frantic like a frightened rabbit's. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he instructed, "and don't let go." She gripped it with both hands, the doll tucked under one arm. They rode in silence as the sun continued its descent. The landscape around them remained unchanging, endless stretches of sagebrush and red rock under a sky so vast and blue it seemed impossible. Inteus kept his eyes moving constantly, scanning the horizon for movement, for dust clouds, for the telltale signs of riders or predators. The Paiute raiders who'd attacked the cart were likely long gone, having taken what they wanted and moved on. But desperation made men unpredictable. And there were other dangers out here, bandits, deserters from the army, wild animals. Inteus had survived 32 years in this harsh land by assuming the worst and preparing for it. Kora said nothing during the ride, just clutched her doll and leaned back against his chest. He could feel her exhaustion in the way her small body sagged with every step of the horse, the way her head drooped forward occasionally before she jerked it back up, fighting sleep. She'd been alone for hours, maybe since early morning, sitting in the burning sun beside her dead parents, waiting for something, anything to happen. The fact that she was still alive was remarkable. The fact that she wasn't completely catatonic was even more so. The cave appeared as the sun touched the distant mountains, casting long purple shadows across the desert floor. Inteus guided his horse up the rocky slope, the animal picking its way carefully over loose stones and scrub brush. When they reached the cave entrance, he dismounted first, then lifted Kora down. Her legs buckled immediately, too weak to support her weight, and he caught her before she hit the ground. He carried her into the cave, a shallow depression carved into the red rock face by centuries of wind and water, just deep enough to provide shelter and block the worst of the desert wind. He set her down gently on a flat stone shelf near the back wall, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and went back outside to tend to his horse. The animal needed water and rest as much as they did. He unsaddled it, rubbed it down with a handful of dry grass, hobbled it near a sparse patch of vegetation, and retrieved his pack and rifle. Inside the cave, Inteus built a small fire using dried sagebrush and strips of juniper bark he kept in his pack for exactly this purpose. The flames caught quickly, casting flickering orange light across the stone walls and driving back the encroaching darkness. Kora watched him work with those same wide, unblinking eyes, tracking every movement he made like she was studying him, trying to decide if he was truly safe or just another threat in a world that had suddenly turned deadly. When the fire was burning steadily, Inteus pulled out his tin cup, filled it with water from his canteen, and handed it to her. She took it with shaking hands and drank slowly this time, more controlled. He unwrapped a piece of dried venison from his pack, tough and salty from the curing process, and tore off a small piece for her. She took it, chewed mechanically but barely swallowed. Her throat worked like it hurt to get the food down. "You need to eat," he said gently, offering another piece. "I know," she whispered, but she didn't take it. Her eyes had gone distant, unfocused, staring at the fire but not really seeing it. Inteus didn't push. He'd seen this before too, the way trauma shut down the body's natural responses. He ate his own portion in silence, chewing slowly, then leaned back against the cave wall and watched the fire. Outside, the desert had gone completely dark now, the temperature dropping fast the way it always did once the sun disappeared. Soon the night sounds would begin. Right on schedule, coyotes started their chorus somewhere in the distance, high-pitched yipping and howling that echoed across the empty land. Kora flinched violently at the sound, her whole body going rigid. "They won't come near the fire," Inteus said calmly. "Animals fear fire. We're safe here." "You're sure?" Her voice was so small, so frightened. "I'm sure. I've camped here before. Nothing has ever bothered me." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and scooted closer to the flames, seeking their warmth and protection. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave ceiling. The stars began to appear through the cave opening, cold and distant and indifferent to the suffering of those below. Finally, Kora's voice broke the silence, tentative and afraid. "Where are we going?" Inteus considered the question carefully. He had no real plan, no destination in mind. He'd been riding alone for weeks, maybe months, moving from place to place, avoiding settlements and people, living off the land the way his father and grandfather had taught him before the wars came and destroyed everything. But now he had a child, a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. He couldn't just leave her somewhere and walk away. "There's a trading post," he said finally. 3 days' ride north of here, run by a man named Hutchins. Good man. He might know of families looking to take in a child, or maybe there's a mission nearby. Kora's face fell, her expression crumpling. "You're leaving me there?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since finding her, and saw not just a frightened child, but a person who'd lost everything in the span of hours. Parents, home, future, all gone. And now the one person who'd helped her was talking about handing her off to strangers. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "We'll see when we get there." "But you're leaving me." It wasn't a question this time. It was an accusation, quiet but cutting. "I don't have a home, Kora. I move around. That's not a life for a child. It's better than being alone." Her voice cracked on the last word, and tears began sliding down her cheeks again. Silent this time, just steady streams reflecting the firelight. Inteus felt something tighten in his chest, something he'd thought had died years ago when he'd buried his own son. "You won't be alone," he said. "I'll make sure whoever takes you in is good people. I promise you that. Promise you won't leave me." The desperation in her voice was painful to hear. Inteus hesitated. Promises were dangerous things in this world. Promises could break you when you couldn't keep them. He'd promised his wife he'd protect their family, and he'd failed. He'd promised his people he'd fight for their land, and he'd lost. Promises were just words, and words meant nothing against bullets and disease and the relentless march of settlers taking everything. But he looked at this small, fragile girl sitting in a cave in the middle of nowhere, orphaned and terrified, clinging to a cloth doll like it was the only solid thing left in her world, and he couldn't bring himself to say no. "I promise I won't leave you until you're safe and cared for. That's the best I can offer right now." It wasn't the answer she wanted. He could see that in the way her face fell, in the way her shoulders sagged. But she nodded anyway, accepting what little he could give. "Okay," she whispered. She lay down on the stone shelf, curling into a tight ball, with the blanket wrapped around her and the doll clutched to her chest. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her, and her breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. Inteus stayed awake, feeding the fire, watching the entrance, listening to the night sounds outside. He'd learned long ago that sleep was a luxury he couldn't always afford. As the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, Inteus found himself thinking about the promise he'd just made. He'd meant every word, but he also knew the reality of this land. Finding good people to take in an orphan girl wasn't easy. Most families out here had barely enough to feed their own children. And even if he found someone, how could he be sure they'd treat her well? How could he walk away not knowing? He looked at Kora, sleeping fitfully by the fire, her small face relaxed in exhaustion, but still carrying traces of the fear and grief that would probably never fully leave her. She looked so much like his own daughter would have looked if she'd lived past infancy. That same delicate bone structure, that same vulnerability. He pushed the thought away. That path led to pain he'd spent years trying to bury, but the promise remained, hanging in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Dawn broke cold and sharp across the high desert. Inteus woke to the sound of Kora whimpering in her sleep, her small body curled tight against the cave wall, trembling despite the blanket wrapped around her. He'd kept the fire going through the night, feeding it steadily with dried brush and wood he'd gathered before dark, but the desert cold had a way of seeping into bones regardless. He moved quietly, added more fuel to the embers, until flames licked upward again, then heated water in his tin cup over the fire. When it was warm enough, he mixed in a small amount of dried herbs his grandmother had taught him to carry, plants that settled the stomach and calmed the nerves. He knelt beside Kora and touched her shoulder gently. She jerked awake instantly, eyes wide with panic, her body going rigid. For a moment she didn't recognize him, didn't remember where she was, and he saw raw terror flash across her face. Then memory returned, and with it a different kind of fear, the fear of someone who knew exactly how bad things were. "It's morning," Inteus said softly. "We need to get moving soon. Drink this first." He offered her the warm cup. Kora sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. Her muscles would be stiff from sleeping on stone, from the trauma of yesterday, from everything her small body had endured. She took the cup with both hands and sipped cautiously. The bitter taste made her wrinkle her nose, but she kept drinking. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Medicine. It'll help with the hurting." She finished it without complaint, then handed the cup back. Her eyes were clearer this morning, more focused, but also more aware of her situation. Yesterday she'd been in shock. Today she understood that her parents were truly gone, and she was alone with a stranger heading to an unknown destination. Inteus could see all of that understanding weighing on her small shoulders. He pulled out the last of his dried venison and a small piece of hardtack bread he'd been saving. It wasn't much, but it would keep them going until they could find better supplies. He gave Kora the larger portion and watched as she forced herself to eat, chewing mechanically, swallowing with visible effort. "The trading post I mentioned," Inteus said as they ate. "It's 3 days north if we push hard, maybe 4 if we take it slow. There's not much between here and there except open country and one small creek where we can refill water. You understand?" Kora nodded. "Will there be other children there?" The question caught him off guard. He considered lying, offering false comfort, but decided against it. "I don't know, maybe. Hutchins has a wife. I met her once years ago. She seemed kind. What if they don't want me?" The vulnerability in her voice made his chest tighten. "Then we'll find someone who does. What if nobody wants me?" Inteus met her eyes directly. "That won't happen." "I won't let it." It was another promise, reckless and dangerous, but he meant it. He'd failed his own family, failed his people, but he wouldn't fail this child if he could help it. They packed up quickly, Inteus erasing signs of their camp out of long habit. In this territory, leaving evidence of your presence was asking for trouble. He checked his rifle, made sure his knife was secure, then saddled his horse and lifted Kora up first before mounting behind her. They rode north into a landscape that seemed to stretch forever, broken only by distant mesas and the occasional cluster of juniper trees. The sky was cloudless, promising another day of brutal sun once it climbed higher. Inteus kept the pace steady, but not punishing, aware that Kora was already exhausted and that pushing too hard would break her. She sat silently in front of him, clutching her doll, occasionally reaching up to grip the saddle horn when the horse navigated rougher terrain. Hours passed, with only the sound of hooves on hard ground and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Around midday, Kora spoke suddenly. "My papa said the West was supposed to be full of opportunities. He said we'd have land of our own, and everything would be better than Ohio. Intius didn't respond immediately. He'd heard similar stories from countless settlers, all chasing the same dream, most finding only hardship and death. "What did your papa do in Ohio?" he asked. "He was a clerk." "In the bank, but the bank closed and he couldn't find work. That's why we left." Her voice was matter-of-fact, reciting information without emotion. "Mama didn't want to go. She said it was too dangerous. But Papa said we didn't have a choice." "She was right about the danger," Intius said quietly. "Are you angry they brought me out here?" The question surprised him. He thought about it carefully before answering. "No. They were trying to survive, trying to give you a better life. That's what parents do. They couldn't have known what would happen, but you knew it was dangerous. That's why you live out here alone, isn't it? Because you know how to survive." Intius smiled grimly. "I live out here because I don't fit anywhere else anymore. Why not?" The directness of children could be disarming. Intius considered how much truth to share. "I'm Modoc. My people fought a war against the army years ago. We lost. Most of my family died. The ones who survived were sent to reservations, broken up, scattered. I couldn't stay there, couldn't live that way, so I left. Been moving ever since." Kora was quiet for a moment, processing this. "So you're alone too?" "Yes." "Then we're the same." The simple observation hit harder than it should have. In some fundamental way, she was right. They were both displaced, both without family, both trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush people like them. By late afternoon, they reached the creek Intius had mentioned, a thin ribbon of water cutting through red rock. It would be dry by summer's end, but for now it ran clear and cold. Intius dismounted and helped Kora down, then led the horse to drink while he refilled his canteen and water skin. Kora knelt by the water's edge and splashed her face, washing away some of the accumulated dust and grime. When she looked up at Intius, her face was cleaner, but her eyes were haunted. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. When you found me yesterday, why did you stop? Why didn't you just keep riding?" It was a fair question, one Intius had been asking himself. "Because leaving you there would have been the same as killing you myself. I couldn't do that. But lots of people would have. Papa said most folks out here only care about themselves." Intius crouched beside her, looking out at the desert, stretching endlessly in all directions. "Your papa wasn't entirely wrong. This land makes people hard, but being hard doesn't mean being cruel. There's a difference. What's the difference? Hard means you do what you have to do to survive. Cruel means you enjoy causing suffering. I'm hard, but I'm not cruel." Kora studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. They rested by the creek for an hour, letting the horse graze on the sparse grass growing along the water's edge. Intius used the time to check his supplies, taking inventory of what they had and what they'd need. His food stores were running dangerously low, maybe 2 days' worth if they rationed carefully. He'd planned to hunt before supplies became critical, but that was before he had a child to protect. Hunting meant leaving her alone or taking her with him, and neither option was good. He'd have to hope they reached the trading post before starvation became a real concern. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Intius made another decision. "We'll ride a few more hours, then camp for the night. Tomorrow we'll cover more distance." Kora nodded without complaint. He was beginning to understand that she was tougher than she looked, that she had a core of resilience that had kept her alive when she should have died. When he lifted her back onto the horse, she settled in without hesitation, already becoming accustomed to the routine. The second night they camped in the open. No cave this time. Just a small depression between 2 large boulders that provided minimal shelter from the wind. Intius built another fire, smaller and more concealed, and they shared the last of the venison. Kora ate slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, making it last. She was learning to live with hunger, a skill that would serve her well if she stayed in this country. As darkness settled and stars emerged in their thousands, Kora spoke again. "Intius?" "Yes?" "What happened to your family?" "You said they died." He'd known this question would come eventually. He stared into the fire, watching flames dance and flicker. "My wife and son died of fever 8 years ago. There was an outbreak in our village. Lots of people died. The army had moved us to a reservation by then. Too many people crowded together, not enough food or clean water. Sickness spread fast. How old was your son? 5 months. His voice was flat, emotionless, the only way he could speak about it without breaking. I'm sorry, Kora said quietly. Me too. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Kora asked, do you think about them? Every day. Does it get easier? Intis considered lying, offering false hope, but decided she deserved honesty. No, you just get better at carrying it. Kora absorbed this information, her young face serious in the firelight. My mama used to sing to me at night. She had a nice voice. Sometimes I can't remember what it sounded like anymore, and that scares me. That's normal. Memory fades. But the feeling doesn't. You'll always remember how she made you feel, even if the details get fuzzy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. How she made me feel was safe. Her voice cracked, and now I'm not. Intius had no answer for that because she was absolutely right. She wasn't safe, might never be truly safe again. That was the reality of this world, especially for orphaned children. But he could try to change that, could try to find her a place where safety might be possible. The third day brought unexpected complications. They were riding through a narrow canyon, following a trail that wound between high rock walls, when Intius spotted smoke on the horizon. Not the thin, dispersed smoke of a campfire, but thick black columns that suggested something larger. He reined in the horse and studied the smoke's direction and density. Kora felt his tension. What is it? Trouble, maybe. Or maybe nothing. Hard to tell from here. He debated his options. The smoke was roughly in the direction they needed to go, but not directly on their path. He could swing wide, add half a day to their journey, or investigate to see if someone needed help. The decision was complicated by the fact that he had Kora with him now. Taking risks was different when you were responsible for someone else. We're going to go carefully, he said finally. Stay quiet, stay close to me. Understand? Kora nodded, her fingers tightening on the saddle horn. They approached cautiously, Intius keeping to the low ground, using rocks and vegetation for cover. As they got closer, the source of the smoke became clear. A small homestead was burning, the wooden structures already collapsed into smoldering ruins. Intius dismounted 100 yards away, told Kora to stay with the horse, and approached on foot with his rifle ready. The homestead was destroyed, completely gutted by fire. Bodies lay in the yard, 3 of them, a man and 2 older boys. They'd been dead for hours, killed before the fire started, if the wound patterns were any indication. Intius checked the bodies quickly, professionally, looking for anything that might identify the attackers or suggest why this had happened. He found his answer in the form of a wooden sign that had fallen near the well, partially burned, but still readable. It was a territorial boundary marker, the kind used to claim land under the Homestead Act. Someone had wanted this family off this land badly enough to kill for it. Intius heard a sound behind him and spun. Rifle raised, only to find Kora standing 10 feet away. She'd ignored his instruction to stay with the horse and followed him. Her eyes were fixed on the bodies, her face pale. I told you to stay back, he said sharply. I heard something. In the barn, Intius went still, listening. The barn was partially collapsed, still smoking, but structurally intact enough that someone could be inside. He motioned for Kora to get behind him, then approached the barn slowly. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burned hay. And there, huddled in the far corner, was a boy about 10 years old, face blackened with soot, eyes wide with terror. When he saw Intius, he grabbed a pitchfork and raised it defensively. "Stay back!" the boy shouted, his voice breaking. "I'll fight you!" Intius lowered his rifle immediately, raised his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Intius. I found your homestead burning and came to see if anyone needed help." The boy didn't lower the pitchfork. "You're Indian." "I'm Modoc, yes. Indians did this. They killed my pa and my brothers." Intius shook his head slowly. No, Indians didn't do this. How do you know? Because I know what Indian raids look like. This wasn't one. Someone wanted your land and made it look like an Indian attack to cover their tracks. The boy wavered, the pitchfork drooping slightly. You're lying. Look at the wounds on your father and brothers. Bullet wounds, not arrows. Look at how the fire was set deliberately to destroy everything. Raiders don't burn homesteads, they loot them. This was murder disguised as a raid. The truth of Intius's words seemed to reach the boy. The pitchfork fell from his hands, and he collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Intius moved forward carefully, knelt beside him, and put a hand on his shoulder. The boy didn't pull away, just shook with grief and rage and fear. Kora appeared in the barn doorway, her face filled with recognition. She knew what this boy was feeling because she'd felt it 2 days ago. She walked over and sat down next to him, not saying anything, just being present. After a long moment, the boy looked up at Intius through tears. "What do I do now?" he asked. Intius felt the weight of that question. One orphan had become 2. One responsibility had become double. And he still had no real home to offer, no solution to propose, just the same dangerous promise he'd made to Kora. "What's your name?" Intius asked. Thomas, you're going to come with us. We're heading to a trading post 3 days north. When we get there, we'll figure out what comes next. But right now, you need to gather anything you can carry that's useful. Water, food, blankets, tools, whatever survived the fire. Thomas nodded numbly and began moving through the barn, collecting items with mechanical efficiency. Intius caught Kora's eye. She looked at him with something like understanding, maybe even approval. They'd both lost everything. Now they had each other, and Thomas and a Modoc scout who'd somehow become responsible for 2 orphaned children in the span of 3 days. As Thomas packed supplies and Kora helped him sort through salvageable items, Intius stepped outside and studied the horizon. Whoever had done this might still be nearby, watching, waiting to make sure no one survived to tell the truth about what happened here. He needed to get these children to safety, and he needed to do it fast. They reached Hutchins' trading post just after noon on the 5th day, later than Intius had planned, but safer than pushing through exhausted. The post sat in a wide valley where 2 trails converged, a collection of rough-hewn buildings surrounding a main structure built from logs and adobe. Smoke rose from the chimney, and horses stood tied to rails outside, maybe a dozen, which meant other travelers or traders were present. Intius felt his guard go up immediately. More people meant more complications, more questions, more potential threats. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, to controlling his environment by avoiding crowds. But the children needed food, proper shelter, and he needed information about where they might find permanent homes. He had no choice but to engage with civilization again, however uncomfortable that made him. Thomas rode behind him now, sharing the horse with Kora, who sat in front. The boy had barely spoken since they'd left his burned homestead, his grief manifesting as stony silence. Kora had tried talking to him a few times, sharing small observations about the landscape or asking simple questions, but Thomas responded with single words or not at all. As they approached the trading post, a man emerged from the main building, hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. He was broad-shouldered and grey-bearded, wearing a leather apron stained with what looked like tobacco juice. His eyes narrowed when he saw Intius, then widened slightly when he noticed the children. "Intius," the man said, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you again. Thought you'd gone completely native, living out in the rocks somewhere." "Hutchins," Intius replied, bringing his horse to a stop. "Need supplies and information." Hutchins's gaze moved to the children, taking in their dirty faces, torn clothes, and haunted expressions. "Those yours?" "Found them. Parents dead. They need help." Hutchins scratched his beard, studying the situation. "Hell of a thing! Come inside. We'll talk." Intius dismounted and helped both children down. Kora's legs buckled slightly, still not used to long days in the saddle, and Thomas caught her elbow to steady her. It was the first helpful gesture Intius had seen from the boy since finding him. They followed Hutchins into the trading post, which was dim and cool after the bright sunlight outside. The interior was exactly as Intius remembered, crowded with goods hanging from rafters and stacked on shelves. Furs, tools, sacks of flour and beans, bolts of cloth, ammunition, whiskey bottles, everything a traveler might need. 4 men sat at a rough table in the corner, playing cards and drinking. They looked up when Intius entered, their conversation stopping abruptly. Intius recognized the type immediately. Drifters, possibly outlaws, men who lived in the spaces between towns where law didn't reach. One of them, a lean man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, stared at Intius with open hostility. "You let Indians in here now, Hutchins?" the scarred man said. Hutchins didn't even glance at him. "My post, my rules. You don't like it, there's the door." The scarred man spat on the floor but said nothing more. Hutchins gestured for Intius and the children to follow him to the back room, away from the card players. The back room served as both living quarters and office, with a small cot, a desk covered in papers, and shelves lined with account books. A woman sat at the desk, working on what looked like inventory lists. She stood when they entered, and Intius recognized Mary Hutchins, though she'd aged considerably since he'd last seen her. "Mary," Hutchins said, "we've got a situation. Intius here found these children, orphans, need feeding and looking after while we figure out what to do." Mary's face softened immediately. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, weathered by frontier life but with kind eyes. She knelt down to be at eye level with Kora and Thomas. "You poor dears. When did you last eat a proper meal?" Neither child answered. Mary looked up at Intius, questions in her eyes. "The girl, Kora, I found 3 days ago. Parents killed by raiders who made it look like Paiute work. The boy, Thomas, 2 days ago. His family's homestead was burned, his father and brothers murdered. Someone wanted their land." Mary's expression hardened. "Land grabbers, getting worse every month. The territorial government won't do anything about it because half of them are in on the schemes." She stood and moved to a cupboard, pulling out bread, cheese, and dried apples. "Sit, both of you. Eat slowly, or you'll make yourselves sick." Kora and Thomas sat at the small table and began eating with the desperate intensity of the truly hungry. Hutchins poured himself a whiskey and offered one to Intius, who declined. "So what's your plan?" Hutchins asked. "You planning to keep them?" "No, I can't. I have no home, no stable situation. They need families, real homes. Families willing to take in orphans are rare out here. Most folks can barely feed their own." "I know. That's why I came to you. You hear things, know people. There must be someone." Hutchins was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There's a mission school 2 weeks south, near Fort Douglas, run by Methodist missionaries. They take in orphaned children, educate them, find them work or apprenticeships when they're old enough." Intius felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard of such places. Some were genuinely charitable, but others were little more than labor camps, where children were worked to exhaustion under the guise of Christian education. "What do you know about this mission?" "Not much personally. Met the head missionary once, seemed sincere enough." "But you know how these things go. Some are good, some aren't," Mary interjected from where she was watching the children eat. "There's another option. The Carlsons, family about 40 miles west of here. They run a ranch, good people. Lost their only daughter to cholera last year. I heard Margaret Carlson mention she'd thought about taking in an orphan, but that was months ago. Intius considered both options, neither feeling right. Sending the children to strangers, hoping for the best, seemed like abandoning them. But what alternative did he have? He couldn't keep wandering the territory with 2 young children in tow. That was a recipe for disaster. Before he could respond, Thomas spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. "I'm not going to any mission school." His voice was flat but firm. Mary looked at him gently. "It might be a good place, Thomas. You'd have regular meals, education, other children your age." I said no. "They'll try to make me forget my family, forget what happened." "I won't do it." Kora, who'd been eating quietly, added her voice. "I want to stay with Intius." Intius felt all eyes turn to him. This was the complication he'd feared, the emotional attachment that made rational decisions nearly impossible. "Kora, I told you, I can't take care of you properly. You need a real home. You are a real home, she said, her eyes filling with tears. You saved me. You kept me safe. That's what fathers do. The word father hit him like a physical blow. Before Intius could respond, the door to the back room burst open. The scarred man from the card game stood there, swaying slightly, clearly drunk. I got a question for the Indian, he said, his words slurred. You one of them Modocs who killed all those soldiers in the lava beds? You one of Captain Jack's murderers? Hutchins moved between them immediately. Get out, Crawford. You're drunk and you're causing trouble. Crawford ignored him, his eyes fixed on Intius with drunken rage. My brother died in that war, killed by savages hiding in rocks. You probably killed him yourself. Intius remained perfectly still, his voice calm. The Modoc War ended over a decade ago. I was there, yes, I fought, but I didn't murder anyone. We were defending our land. Defending? Crawford laughed bitterly. You were slaughtering settlers, women and children. That's not true and you know it. But you're drunk and looking for a fight. I won't give you one. Not here, not in front of children. Crawford's hand moved toward his gun, but Hutchins already had his own revolver drawn and pointed at the man's head. You draw that weapon in my establishment, and I'll put a hole in you big enough to see daylight through. Now get out. You're barred. Don't come back. Crawford stared at Hutchins for a long moment, then at Intius, his face twisted with hatred. Finally he turned and stumbled out, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room remained thick. Mary had moved protectively in front of the children during the confrontation. Hutchins holstered his gun and sighed. Sorry about that. Crawford's been drinking heavy since he got here yesterday. Lost his brother in the war, lost his farm to debt, now he's just angry at the world. Men like that are dangerous, Intius said. He might come back. If he does, I'll handle it. But you're right to be concerned. Might be best if you and the children stay here tonight, inside where it's safe. We've got a storage room you can use. Intius nodded, grateful. He'd been planning to camp outside town, but after Crawford's outburst, staying close to allies made more sense. As evening fell, Mary prepared a proper meal, the first hot food the children had eaten in days. Stew with actual vegetables, fresh bread, and even a small dessert of canned peaches. Kora and Thomas ate until they couldn't hold any more. Their bellies full for the first time since becoming orphans. After dinner, Mary sat with the children, while Hutchins and Intius talked in low voices near the fireplace. The Carlson option is your best bet, Hutchins said. I can ride out there tomorrow, talk to them, see if they're still interested in taking a child. Though with 2 children now, I don't know if they'd take both. They'd have to stay together, Intius said firmly. They've both lost their families. Separating them would be cruel. That limits your options significantly. Most families can't afford 2 extra mouths to feed. Intius stared into the fire, feeling trapped. Every option seemed wrong, every choice filled with potential for harm. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in a Modoc village where children were treasured, protected, raised communally. The white world didn't work that way. Here, orphans were burdens, problems to be solved, shipped off to institutions or indentured to families who might or might not treat them well. There's another possibility, Mary said, joining the conversation. She'd been listening while mending one of Kora's torn dresses. You could keep them yourself. Both men looked at her. Intius shook his head. I already explained why that's not possible. You explained why you think it's not possible. But I watched you with those children all evening. You're already acting like a father, whether you admit it or not. Acting like a father and being one are different things. I have no home, no income beyond what I can hunt or trade. How would I feed them? Where would we live? Mary set down her mending and looked at him directly. The territorial government is still offering homestead grants. 160 acres to anyone willing to work the land for 5 years. You could file a claim, build a cabin, raise those children properly. Intius felt anger rise in his chest. The same government that drove my people from our land, that killed my family, now wants to give me stolen land. That's your solution? It's not justice, Mary admitted. But it's survival, and those children need you to choose survival over pride. The words stung because they were true. His pride, his anger at what had been done to his people was valid. But Kora and Thomas didn't care about historical injustices. They cared about having someone who wouldn't abandon them, someone who'd proven they could be trusted. Hutchins spoke up. There's a valley about 30 miles northeast of here. Good water, decent soil, sheltered. Nobody's claimed it yet because it's remote. You could build there, file the paperwork here. I'd help with supplies on credit until you got established. Before Intius could respond, a sound came from outside. Shouting, the thunder of hooves, then gunfire. Intius and Hutchins grabbed their rifles and rushed to the window. Outside, lit by lantern light, Crawford had returned with 3 other men, all on horseback, all armed. They were circling the trading post, firing shots into the air and shouting drunken threats. "Come out, Indian!" Crawford bellowed. "Face me like a man instead of hiding behind white folks," Hutchins swore. "He's brought friends. This is going to get ugly." More shots rang out, one shattering a window. Mary quickly herded the children into the storage room and barricaded the door. Intius checked his rifle, his face calm despite the chaos. This kind of violence was familiar to him, something he'd lived through countless times during the war and after. "I'll go out," Intius said. "Talk to them. Maybe I can end this without more bloodshed." "That's suicide," Hutchins said. "Crawford wants you dead. Talking won't change that. Maybe not. But if I stay in here, they'll burn the whole post down to get to me. At least outside I have a chance." Intius moved toward the door, but before he could reach it, a different sound cut through the night. A rifle shot, loud and authoritative, followed by a voice shouting commands. "This is Deputy Marshal Warren. You men are disturbing the peace and endangering civilians. Drop your weapons and dismount immediately, or I will open fire." Intius peered through the broken window and saw a man on horseback, badge glinting on his chest, rifle aimed at Crawford's group. Behind him were 2 more riders, also armed, also wearing badges. The deputy marshal had arrived with backup, likely passing through and hearing the commotion. Crawford's group hesitated, their drunken bravado wavering in the face of actual law enforcement. One by one they lowered their weapons. The deputy marshal and his men dismounted, disarmed Crawford's group, and lined them up against the trading post wall. Intius watched as the marshal questioned them, gesturing toward the building, clearly trying to understand what had prompted the attack. After several minutes, the marshal approached the trading post door and knocked. "Hutchins, it's Warren." "It's safe now." Hutchins opened the door and the marshal stepped inside, taking off his hat. He was a lean man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. His gaze immediately found Intius. "You're the cause of this?" he asked, not accusatory, just gathering facts. "I'm Modoc. That makes me the cause in some men's eyes." Warren nodded slowly. "Crawford says you're a war criminal from the Modoc conflicts. Says you should be hanged. Crawford is drunk and angry and wrong. I fought in that war, yes, but I was never charged with crimes. The war ended with amnesty for most fighters. Most, but not all. Captain Jack and his top commanders were hanged. I wasn't a commander. I was a young man fighting for his people's survival." Warren studied Intius for a long moment, then turned to Hutchins. "You vouch for him?" "I do. Intius has always dealt fair with me. He's no criminal." The marshal nodded. "Good enough for me. Crawford and his friends will spend the night in my custody, sober up, then get escorted out of the territory. They cause any more trouble, they'll face actual charges." He put his hat back on and headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I served in that war too. Saw what happened on both sides. Wasn't as simple as heroes and villains like some folks want to believe. After the marshal and his prisoners departed, the trading post slowly returned to calm." Mary brought the children out of the storage room, both of them shaken but unharmed. Kora ran to Intius and wrapped her arms around his waist, holding tight. Thomas stood apart, watching, his face unreadable. "Are they gone?" Kora asked. "They're gone. You're safe. But they wanted to hurt you because of what you are." Intius knelt down so he could look her in the eye. "Some people carry hate in their hearts and need someone to blame for their pain. It's not right, but it's real. You need to understand that if you stay with me, that kind of thing will happen sometimes. I don't care, Kora said firmly. You're still the person who saved me. That's what matters, Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet. My pa used to say Indians were savages, but you're not. You're the only one who stopped to help when we needed it. That makes you better than most white folks I've known. The boy's words carried weight because they came from someone who'd lost everything and had every reason to be bitter. Inteus looked at both children, then at Mary and Hutchins, who were watching this entire exchange with knowing expressions. He thought about the valley Hutchins had mentioned, about the possibility of building something permanent, about what it might mean to actually try to create a home again after years of wandering. The idea terrified him. Building meant putting down roots, meant making yourself vulnerable, meant risking loss all over again. But looking at these two children who'd somehow become his responsibility, he realized that not trying was its own kind of loss. The valley you mentioned, Inteus said to Hutchins. Tell me more about it. Hutchins smiled, the first genuine smile Inteus had seen from him. It's got a creek that runs year-round, timber for building, good grazing for horses or cattle if you're inclined. Sheltered by hills on three sides, which means protection from weather and from unwanted visitors. It's hard land, won't give you anything easy, but it's honest land. You work it, it'll work for you. And the homestead claim process? I've got the forms here. You sign eyewitness, send it to the territorial office. 5 years of continuous residence and improvement, then the land's yours, free and clear. It's what they call proving up the claim. Mary added, I can help with the initial supplies. Seeds for planting, tools, basic foodstuffs to get you through the first season. Consider it an investment. When you get established, you'll trade with us regular. Everybody benefits. Inteus felt the walls he'd built around himself over the past decade beginning to crack. These people were offering him a chance at something he'd thought was lost forever, a future, a purpose, a reason to stay in one place. And more than that, they were offering these children a chance at a real childhood, something more than just survival. He looked down at Kora and Thomas. If I do this, if we try to make a home together, you both need to understand something. It won't be easy. There will be hard work, cold winters, times when we're hungry or scared. I'll do my best, but I'm not perfect. I'll make mistakes. Kora smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since finding her by that overturned cart. That's okay. Families make mistakes. That's what my mama always said. Thomas nodded his agreement. I can work. I'm strong. I can help build. Inteus felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 8 years, something warm and painful and frighteningly hopeful. It might have been the beginning of healing, or it might have been the first crack before a complete collapse. He wouldn't know until he tried. The valley exceeded Hutchins' description. Inteus stood at the ridge overlooking it 3 days after leaving the trading post, with Kora seated in front of him and Thomas riding a borrowed mule alongside them, and felt something close to peace. The creek ran silver through the center, flanked by cottonwoods and willows that promised water even in the driest months. The meadow grass grew thick and green, and the surrounding hills provided natural windbreaks while offering sightlines in all directions. It was defensible, sustainable, and remote enough that curious neighbors wouldn't be a constant problem. He could see why no one had claimed it yet. The remoteness that made it safe also made it impractical for most settlers who craved community and easy access to supplies. But for a Modoc scout accustomed to solitude and 2 orphaned children who'd learned to distrust the world, isolation was a feature rather than a flaw. They descended into the valley as the afternoon sun painted everything gold. Kora pointed excitedly at a doe and her fawn drinking from the creek. And even Thomas showed a flicker of interest when a red-tailed hawk swooped low over the meadow hunting field mice. Inteus chose the building site carefully, on a slight rise near the creek, but elevated enough to avoid spring flooding. A cluster of ponderosa pines provided shade and additional protection from north winds. The soil looked workable for a garden, and there was ample timber for construction within reasonable hauling distance. He dismounted and walked the perimeter, his mind already planning the layout. A single-room cabin to start, maybe 16 by 20 feet, with a sleeping loft for the children. Stone fireplace on the north wall for heating and cooking. A small barn for the horse and any future livestock. A root cellar for storing food through winter. It would take months to build properly, and they'd need to work fast to have shelter before the first snows came. Thomas slid off the mule and joined him, studying the ground with the practical eye of someone who'd grown up on a homestead. My pa always said to orient the door facing south for light and warmth. And you'll want the barn close enough for convenience, but far enough that the smell doesn't reach the house. Intius nodded, impressed by the boy's knowledge. Your father taught you well. He taught me lots of things. Just wish I'd paid better attention. They spent the first week establishing a temporary camp and beginning the initial work. Intius taught both children how to construct a lean-to shelter using pine branches and canvas. How to dig a proper fire pit that wouldn't spread, how to filter creek water through sand and charcoal to make it safer for drinking. Kora proved surprisingly capable, despite her young age, her small hands quick and nimble when tying knots or gathering kindling. Thomas worked with determined silence, throwing himself into physical labor as if trying to exhaust his grief into submission. Intius recognized the coping mechanism because he'd done the same thing after losing his own family. Work became a way to avoid thinking, to avoid feeling, to focus on something tangible and controllable. He let the boy work himself tired every day, knowing that eventually the grief would demand acknowledgement. But for now, the distraction was probably healthy. Each morning they rose with the sun and worked until dark. Intius felled trees using an axe Hutchins had provided on credit, trimming and stripping the logs, while Thomas and Kora dragged branches away to be used for firewood or smaller construction projects. The work was brutally hard, and Intius felt muscles he'd forgotten about screaming in protest. But there was something deeply satisfying about it too. Something primal and right about shaping the land with his own hands. About building shelter for these children who depended on him. In the evenings, after a simple meal of whatever game Intius had hunted that day and the beans and cornmeal from their dwindling supplies, they would sit by the fire and talk. Kora asked endless questions about everything, how birds knew where to fly, why the creek made different sounds over rocks versus sand, what stars were made of. Intius answered what he could, and admitted ignorance when he couldn't, which seemed to satisfy her curiosity more than false knowledge would have. Thomas remained more reserved, but occasionally he would share memories of his father and brothers, small stories that kept their memory alive. One night, about 2 weeks into their work on the cabin, Thomas asked a question that surprised Intius. "Will you teach me to track like you do?" Intius looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Why do you want to learn?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Because you see things nobody else sees. You knew those men were coming to the trading post before anyone else did. You found water when we were thirsty and game when we were hungry. That's a useful skill out here. Intius considered this. Teaching the boy traditional Modoc tracking methods felt like passing on something sacred, something that belonged to his people. But Thomas was right, that the skills were practical and potentially life-saving. And if they were going to build a life in this valley, the boy would need to know how to read the land, how to understand the language of broken twigs and disturbed soil and animal behavior. "I'll teach you," Intius said finally. "But you have to understand it's not just about following footprints. It's about seeing the whole picture, understanding how everything connects. Animals, weather, plants, people, they all leave signs if you know how to read them." Thomas nodded seriously. "I want to learn all of it." So the lessons began. Each morning before the heavy construction work started, Intius would take Thomas out into the valley and surrounding hills, teaching him to observe. How to tell fresh tracks from old by the sharpness of edges and presence of moisture. How to read scat to determine what an animal had eaten and when. How wind direction affected scent trails and animal movement patterns. how to move quietly through brush without disturbing the natural rhythm of the forest. Thomas absorbed the knowledge with intense focus, practicing constantly, pointing out things he noticed and asking if his interpretations were correct. Inteus found himself enjoying the teaching, rediscovering skills he'd taken for granted through the eyes of an eager student. Kora sometimes joined these morning lessons, though her interest was less practical and more philosophical. She wanted to know why animals behaved certain ways, what they felt, whether they had families like people did. Her questions pushed Inteus to articulate things he'd always understood intuitively, but never quite put into words. By the end of the first month, the cabin walls were rising. Inteus had chosen to build using the saddle notch technique his father had taught him, interlocking the log ends to create strong corners without needing nails or additional fasteners. The work went faster once Thomas learned to help with the notching, his young hands developing calluses and his thin frame beginning to show muscle from the constant physical labor. Kora's job was to fill the gaps between logs with a mixture of mud, grass and moss, creating chinking that would keep out wind and rain. She took to the work with artistic seriousness, smoothing each section carefully and decorating certain patches with patterns pressed in with her fingers. Inteus didn't comment on the decorations, but he noticed them and found them oddly touching, evidence that she was beginning to think of this place as home rather than just shelter. The roof posed the biggest challenge. Inteus had planned to use split shingles, but the process was time-consuming and required skills he possessed only partially. After struggling for 2 days with logs that split unevenly, he made a decision to ride back to the trading post for help and additional supplies. He debated taking the children with him, but decided against it. The round trip would be faster alone, and he wanted them to begin feeling ownership of this place, which meant trusting them to manage without him for a few days. He spent an evening teaching them safety protocols, what to do if strangers approached, how to hide their camp, where to run if genuine danger threatened. Thomas listened with the seriousness of someone who'd already learned that danger was real and could come without warning. "I'll be back in 4 days," Inteus told them. 5 at most if weather slows me. You have enough food and water. Keep the fire going at night, both for warmth and to discourage predators. If anything feels wrong, trust that feeling and act on it. Understand? Both children nodded. Kora hugged him tightly before he left, and Thomas gripped his hand in a firm shake that was trying very hard to be adult. Inteus rode away at dawn, looking back once to see them standing together by the half-built cabin, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he wanted to admit. The ride to the trading post took a day and a half, and Inteus used the time to think about how dramatically his life had changed in just 6 weeks. He'd gone from a solitary wanderer with no attachments or obligations to something resembling a father with 2 children depending on him. The transformation should have felt suffocating, but instead it felt like waking up after a long, numb sleep. He was feeling things again, fear and hope and responsibility. And while those feelings were sometimes painful, they were better than the emptiness he'd carried for years. Hutchins greeted him with a knowing smile when he arrived. "Wondered when you'd be back. How's the building going?" "Walls are up. Need help with the roof and more supplies. I've got shingles cut and ready. Figured you'd need them. Also got some glass panes came in on the last freight wagon. Thought you might want actual windows instead of just shutters." The offer surprised Inteus. Glass was expensive and fragile, a luxury most frontier cabins went without. "I can't afford glass. Consider it an investment in future trade. You'll owe me, but I'm patient." Over the next day, Inteus and Hutchins loaded a wagon with supplies, shingles, nails, glass panes wrapped in straw, sacks of flour and beans, seed corn and potatoes for planting, a small cast-iron stove to supplement the fireplace, blankets, basic tools, and even a few books Mary insisted the children would need for education. The total debt was staggering by Inteus's standards, but Hutchins waved off his concerns. "You'll pay it back over time through furs, game, whatever you can trade. I'm more interested in having reliable partners in that valley than I am in immediate payment." As Intius prepared to leave, Mary pulled him aside and handed him a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Open it later," she said quietly. "Just something I thought you might need." He thanked her and secured the bundle in the wagon. The return journey took longer with the loaded wagon, and Intius found himself anxious to get back, worried about the children despite trusting their basic competence. He pushed the horse as fast as he dared, camping only when darkness made travel dangerous. When he finally crested the ridge overlooking the valley on the afternoon of the fourth day, relief flooded through him. The cabin stood unchanged, smoke rising from the fire pit, and he could see two small figures moving around the structure. As he descended into the valley, Kora spotted him and ran toward the wagon, shouting with excitement. Thomas followed at a more measured pace, but Intius could see the relief in the boy's posture. "You came back," Kora said, slightly breathless from running. "I said I would. I know, but I was still worried." Thomas reached them and helped Intius unhitch the horse from the wagon. "We kept everything going like you taught us. No problems. I never doubted it." They spent the evening unloading supplies and sharing a proper meal cooked on the new cast-iron stove, which thrilled both children with its efficiency compared to open fire cooking. After dinner, Intius remembered Mary's bundle and unwrapped it. Inside were 3 items: a carved wooden frame containing a small mirror, a children's primer for teaching reading, and a leather-bound journal with blank pages. A note in Mary's handwriting read, "Every home needs these. The mirror so you remember you're human. The book so they remember they're capable of learning. The journal so someone records that you existed." Intius stared at the gifts for a long moment, feeling the weight of their significance. These weren't just practical items, but symbols of permanence, of a life worth documenting, of a future worth educating children for. He set the mirror on a shelf they'd constructed, placed the primer where the children could reach it, and tucked the journal into his pack. Not yet ready to begin writing, but grateful to have the option. The next 2 months passed in a blur of constant work. With Hutchins's help during a return visit, they completed the roof and installed the glass windows, which transformed the cabin's interior with natural light. Intius built a sleeping loft, accessed by a ladder, giving the children their own space while he slept near the fireplace on the main floor. They constructed a small barn, dug a root cellar, and began clearing land for a garden that would be planted in the spring. Thomas continued his tracking lessons and proved to be a natural, his observations becoming increasingly sophisticated. Kora began learning to read, using the primer Mary had provided, and Intius found himself relearning letters he'd mostly forgotten since his brief time in a mission school as a child. In the evenings, they would sit by the fireplace, and Intius would tell them stories from Modoc tradition, tales of Kamush the Creator, of battles with sky spirits, of the importance of living in balance with the land. The children absorbed these stories with the same attention they gave to everything he taught them, and Intius realized he was passing on something precious, a cultural legacy that would otherwise die with his generation. As autumn deepened and the first frost appeared on the meadow grass, a new challenge emerged. A rider appeared on the ridge one afternoon, surveying the valley with obvious interest. Intius spotted him immediately and felt his guard rise. He told the children to stay inside the cabin while he walked out to meet the potential threat. The rider descended slowly, hands visible and empty of weapons, a deliberate show of peaceful intent. As he got closer, Intius recognized the badge on his chest. It was Deputy Marshal Warren, the man who'd broken up the confrontation at the trading post months earlier. Warren dismounted about 20 yards away and approached on foot. "Intius, isn't it? I remember you from Hutchins's place." "Marshal, what brings you out here?" "Heard you'd filed a homestead claim. Wanted to check on things, make sure everything was legitimate." Intius felt tension coil in his shoulders. The claim was filed properly. "Hutchins witnessed it. I have the papers inside if you need to see them. I'm sure they're in order. That's not really why I'm here." Warren glanced toward the cabin, where Kora's face was visible in the window, watching with wide eyes. Those the orphans you found? They are. You aware that there are questions about your custody of them? The Territorial Child Welfare Office received a complaint. Someone claiming you're an unfit guardian due to your race and history. Inteus felt cold rage begin to build. Who filed the complaint? Complaint was anonymous, but given the timing and language, I'd guess it was Crawford or someone associated with him. Man holds a grudge. So what happens now? You take the children away? Warren shook his head. That's not my jurisdiction, and frankly, I'm not inclined to get involved in that kind of politics. But I wanted to warn you that someone from the Territorial Office might come out here asking questions. You should be prepared. Prepared how? Have everything documented. The homestead claim, evidence you can provide for the children, testimony from people who'll vouch for you. Hutchins and his wife would be good witnesses. Maybe the missionary from Fort Douglas, if you can get him out here. Inteus absorbed this information, his mind already calculating scenarios and preparing defenses. If they try to take the children, I won't cooperate peacefully. Warren met his eyes steadily. I understand the impulse, but fighting the territorial government will end badly for you and worse for those kids. Better to work within the system, prove you're a fit guardian through legal means. The legal system hasn't been particularly fair to my people. No, it hasn't. But it's the only system there is. And from what I've seen, you've got a decent case. You've provided for them, built them a home, kept them safe. That counts for something. After Warren left, Inteus stood in the darkening valley and felt the fragile peace he'd been building begin to crack. He'd known this life was too good to last, that something would threaten it eventually. But he'd hoped for more time, for a chance to establish roots deep enough that they couldn't be torn up easily. That night, he sat the children down and explained the situation honestly. Thomas's face darkened with anger. They can't take us away. This is our home now. Kora's response was simpler and more devastating. Do you want us to leave? The question broke something in Inteus. He pulled her close, something he rarely did, and spoke with absolute conviction. No, I want you to stay. Both of you. I will fight anyone who tries to take you, but I need to fight smart. That means we need to be prepared to prove that this is a real home, and I'm a real father, not just someone keeping you temporarily. You are a real father, Kora said firmly. The realest one I know, Thomas added. My pa used to say that blood doesn't make family. Loyalty does. You've been more loyal to us than most blood relatives would be. Their words strengthened Inteus's resolve. He spent the next week documenting everything. Lists of improvements made to the homestead, accounts of the children's health and education, even beginning to write in the journal Mary had given him, creating a record of their daily lives that could be presented as evidence if needed. He also made a difficult decision and began teaching both children to write their own accounts. Simple daily entries about what they learned and did. The territorial agent arrived on a grey morning in late October when frost still clung to the meadow grass and the children's breath made clouds in the cold air. Inteus spotted the buggy from a distance, 2 horses pulling it along the rough trail that led into the valley, and knew immediately this was the confrontation Warren had warned about. He called the children inside and told them to stay calm, to answer questions honestly, and to remember that the truth was their strongest defense. The agent was a thin man in his 50s named Cornelius Blackwell, wearing a wool suit that seemed absurdly formal for the frontier and carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with papers. He climbed down from the buggy with obvious distaste for the mud on his polished shoes and surveyed the cabin and surroundings with an expression that suggested he'd already reached negative conclusions. A second man remained in the buggy, younger and harder looking, probably hired muscle in case Inteus proved difficult. Blackwell approached the cabin with officious authority and knocked sharply on the doorframe. Inteus opened it and stood in the doorway, making no move to invite the man inside. Are you the individual known as Inteus, currently claiming guardianship of 2 minor children? Blackwell's voice carried the nasal tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I am. I'm Cornelius Blackwell, Territorial Child Welfare Inspector. I'm here to investigate allegations that you are an unfit guardian and to determine the proper placement of the children currently in your custody. The children are not in my custody. They're in my care. There's a difference. Blackwell's expression soured. Semantics won't help you here. May I come inside and conduct my inspection? Inteus stepped aside reluctantly, and Blackwell entered with the air of someone examining a crime scene. His eyes swept over the single-room interior, taking in the simple furnishings, the sleeping loft where Kora and Thomas sat watching, the fireplace with its cooking implements, the shelves with their modest supplies. He pulled out a notebook and began writing observations with quick, scratching strokes of his pen. "Children," he called up to the loft without looking at them, "come down here, please." Kora and Thomas descended the ladder slowly, and Inteus could see the fear in Kora's eyes, despite her attempt to appear brave. Blackwell looked them over with clinical detachment, the way someone might examine livestock at market. "You are Kora and Thomas, correct? Ages 5 and 10 respectively?" "I'm almost 6, Kora said quietly. "And I'm 11 now," Thomas added. "My birthday was last month." Blackwell made notes without acknowledging their corrections. "Are you both in good health? Any illnesses, injuries, or complaints?" "We're fine," Thomas said. "We're healthy and learning lots of things. I'll be the judge of what constitutes adequate care. Now then, tell me about your daily routine. What time do you wake? What do you eat? What education are you receiving?" Thomas glanced at Inteus, who nodded permission to answer. "We wake at sunrise usually. Sometimes earlier, if there's work that needs doing before it gets too hot. We eat oatmeal or cornmeal for breakfast, whatever game Inteus hunts for other meals, and vegetables from what we stored before winter. Inteus is teaching us to read and write, and he teaches us about the land, tracking, how to survive out here." Blackwell's pen scratched disapprovingly. "Survival skills are hardly adequate education for civilized children. Can either of you recite your multiplication tables? Do you know history, geography, proper grammar?" Kora's face fell and Thomas's jaw tightened. Inteus stepped forward. "They've been with me 4 months. Before that, they were traumatized orphans who'd watched their families die. I focused on helping them heal and teaching them practical skills they need to survive in this environment. Academic education is important, and we're working on it. But it's not the only measure of adequate care. Your opinion on education carries very little weight given your own background. I understand you're Modoc, part of the tribe that murdered innocent settlers and United States soldiers." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Inteus felt rage building, but forced his voice to remain level. "I fought in a war for my people's survival. That war ended with amnesty for most participants. I was never charged with crimes, never convicted of anything. Whatever prejudices you bring into this valley have no legal standing." Blackwell smiled thinly. "We'll see about that. Now, children, I need you to answer truthfully. Has this man ever struck you, threatened you, or made you feel unsafe in any way?" "No," both children said simultaneously. "Never," Kora added. "He saved our lives and takes care of us. Children often defend their abusers out of fear. I need you to understand that you can speak freely. Nothing bad will happen if you tell me the truth." Thomas's voice rose with anger. "We are telling the truth. Inteus is the only adult who didn't abandon us when we needed help. He's teaching us, protecting us, building us a home. That's what good fathers do, and he's better at it than most men who share our skin color." The defiance in Thomas's voice seemed to catch Blackwell off guard, but he recovered quickly. A child's emotional attachment is not evidence of proper guardianship. I'll need to examine the living conditions more thoroughly. He spent the next hour poking through every aspect of their lives with intrusive thoroughness. He inspected the food stores in the root cellar and pronounced them inadequate for winter, despite being comparable to what most frontier families maintained. He examined the sleeping loft and declared it cramped and unsuitable, ignoring the fact that many homestead children slept in worse conditions. He questioned the children separately about their daily activities, trying to catch inconsistencies in their stories that might suggest coaching or abuse. He reviewed the homestead claim papers and made notes about various technicalities he claimed were problematic. Through it all, Intius maintained rigid control over his emotions, answering questions calmly and providing documentation when requested. But he could see where this was heading. Blackwell had arrived with his conclusions already formed, and no amount of evidence would change his mind. Finally, after what felt like hours, Blackwell closed his portfolio and delivered his judgment. Based on my inspection, I find this environment unsuitable for the proper raising of civilized children. The guardian is of questionable character and background. The living conditions are primitive at best, and the education being provided falls far short of territorial standards. Furthermore, I have concerns about the isolation of this location and the lack of proper social development opportunities for the children. What does that mean? Kora asked, her voice trembling. It means you'll be coming with me. There's a mission school in Fort Douglas that specializes in caring for orphaned and displaced children. You'll receive proper education, regular meals, religious instruction, and the opportunity to develop into productive citizens. No, Kora said, the word bursting out of her. I'm not going. I'm afraid you don't have a choice in the matter. You're a minor child without legal guardianship, which makes you a ward of the territory. The territorial government has both the right and the responsibility to place you in appropriate care. Thomas moved to stand beside Intius, his young face set with determination. You can't make us go. This is our home. Blackwell's expression hardened. Actually, I can. I have the authority of the territorial government behind me, and I have an armed deputy in that buggy who will enforce my decisions if necessary. Now gather your belongings. We're leaving within the hour. Intius finally spoke, his voice deadly calm. You're not taking these children anywhere without a fight. I don't care what authority you claim to have. Threatening a territorial agent is a criminal offense. I could have you arrested. Then arrest me, but understand that I will not cooperate with kidnapping children from a safe home based on nothing more than your prejudice against my race. This isn't about race. It's about what's best for the children. Don't lie. Everything about this is about race. You walked into this valley with your mind made up before you saw how we live or spoke to the children. You decided a Modoc man couldn't possibly be a fit father, and you're using your position to enforce that bigotry under the cover of law. Blackwell's face flushed with anger. I'll give you one more chance to comply peacefully. Otherwise, I'll return with the territorial marshal and federal troops if necessary, and I'll have you removed from this land and charged with interfering with government business. The children will still be taken, but you'll lose everything in the process. Before Intius could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. Multiple riders coming fast. Everyone turned toward the sound, and Intius felt his hand move instinctively toward his rifle. But as the riders crested the ridge, he recognized the lead horse. It was Hutchins, with Mary riding beside him. Behind them were 5 other riders, including Deputy Marshal Warren, Dr. Fletcher from Red Bluff, and 3 ranchers Intius vaguely recognized from the trading post. The group descended into the valley and dismounted near the cabin. Hutchins approached with a rolled document in his hand, his expression grim. Blackwell. Thought we might find you here. This is official territorial business, Hutchins. Whatever grievance you have can be addressed through proper channels. No grievance. Just bringing you some documents you might want to see before you make any decisions you'll regret. Hutchins unrolled the papers. This is a petition signed by 47 residents of this territory, including business owners, ranchers, a deputy marshal, and a doctor. We're all testifying to Intius's character and his fitness as a guardian to these children. We're also documenting the improvements he's made to this homestead claim and his compliance with all territorial requirements. Blackwell barely glanced at the papers. A petition carries no legal weight in matters of child welfare. My authority supersedes community opinion. Mary stepped forward, her voice sharp. Your authority doesn't supersede the law, and the law says children should be placed in homes that can provide adequate care. This home provides that. These children are healthy, safe, educated according to frontier standards, and most importantly, they're loved. That's more than most orphans in this territory can claim. Love is not a legal standard for guardianship. Maybe it should be, Dr. Fletcher interjected. I've examined both children. They show no signs of abuse, neglect, or malnutrition. Their physical health is excellent, and their emotional state, considering they're orphans who witnessed their parents' deaths, is remarkably stable. That stability comes from the security Intius has provided them. Removing them from this environment would be traumatic and medically inadvisable. Deputy Marshal Warren added his voice. I've been to this valley 3 times now, checking on things. Each visit I've seen improvement. The cabin's solid, the stores are adequate, and the children are clearly being raised with discipline and care. I've also reviewed the homestead claim paperwork personally. Everything's in order. Unless you have specific legal violations to cite, I don't see grounds for removal. Blackwell looked around at the assembled group, clearly not expecting this level of organized resistance. You're all willing to vouch for an Indian raising white children. Have you considered how this looks? The precedent it sets? The precedent it sets, Hutchins said firmly, is that we judge people by their actions rather than their blood. Inteus has acted with more honor and decency than most white men I know. These children are fortunate to have him, and we're not going to stand by while you tear apart a family based on nothing but prejudice. Blackwell's companion finally climbed down from the buggy, hand resting on his holstered pistol. Mr. Blackwell, perhaps we should return to town and approach this through official channels. Warren immediately moved to intercept him, his own hand near his weapon. He'd advise against any escalation here. You're outnumbered and outgunned, and more importantly, you're in the wrong. The tension stretched tight for a long moment. Then Blackwell, realizing he'd lost this particular battle, rolled up his papers with sharp, angry movements. This isn't over. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the territorial governor. I'll be requesting a full investigation into this homestead claim and this so-called guardianship arrangement. And I'll be recommending that federal authorities look into whether Inteus is in violation of treaties restricting Indian movement and land ownership. You do what you need to do, Hutchins said. We'll be here with our documentation and testimony when your superiors come calling. And I suspect they'll be more interested in the facts than you are. Blackwell climbed back into his buggy, snapping orders at his companion. As they drove away, Inteus felt his legs go weak with relief. He'd been prepared to fight, possibly to die defending these children, but he hadn't expected his community to fight for him. After the buggy disappeared over the ridge, the assembled group gathered around the cabin. Mary immediately went to the children, checking on them with maternal concern, while the men discussed strategy with Inteus. He wasn't bluffing about going to the governor, Warren said. You need to be prepared for more official scrutiny. What can I do that I haven't already done? Get the adoption formalized legally. Right now you're operating in a gray area, guardianship by circumstance rather than law. If you go through official adoption proceedings, it becomes much harder for someone like Blackwell to challenge. Hutchins nodded agreement. I can help with the paperwork. It'll take time and there'll be fees, but it's worth doing properly, Dr. Fletcher added. I'll write a formal medical assessment of the children for the court record, and I'd recommend getting character references from as many people as possible. Build a paper trail that's impossible to ignore. Inteus looked at these people who'd ridden hours to stand with him and felt gratitude so profound it was difficult to speak. Why are you doing this? He finally managed to ask. You barely know me. These aren't your children. Why risk making enemies of the territorial government? Hutchins smiled. Because it's the right thing to do, and because out here on the frontier, we can't afford to let good people get crushed by bad laws. We've all benefited from second chances at some point. Seems only fair to offer you the same. One of the ranchers, a weathered man named Coleman, spoke up. Also, Blackwell's an ass. Been using his position to push people around for years. About time someone stood up to him. The group stayed for several hours, helping with chores and offering advice on preparing for winter. When they finally left, promising to return if needed, Inteus stood with the children watching them ride away. Kora slipped her small hand into his. "Are they really going to let us stay?" "I think so. But we need to make it official, do things the legal way, so nobody can question it again." Thomas asked, "What's adoption mean exactly?" "It means I become your father in the eyes of the law, not just in practice. It means you become my legal children, with all the rights and protections that provides." Over the following weeks, Inteus threw himself into the adoption process with the same determination he'd brought to building the cabin. He filled out forms, gathered statements from everyone who would vouch for him, submitted to interviews and inspections. The process was humiliating at times, forcing him to justify his fitness as a parent in ways no white man would be required to do. But he endured it for the children's sake. Kora and Thomas were interviewed separately by a court-appointed guardian who assessed their wishes and welfare. Both children spoke clearly about wanting to stay with Inteus, about feeling safe and loved in their valley home, about learning and growing under his care. Their testimonies carried weight because they were so obviously sincere and uncoached. In December, as the first heavy snows began to fall, the adoption hearing took place in the territorial courthouse 2 days' ride from their valley. Inteus wore his best clothes, cleaned and mended by Mary, and stood before a judge with the children at his side and half the valley's population sitting in support behind them. The judge, an older man named Morrison with a reputation for fairness, reviewed all the documentation carefully. He questioned Inteus about his plans for the children's education, their future, how he would support them as they grew. He examined the character references, the medical assessments, the homestead claim papers. He even questioned the children directly, asking if they understood what adoption meant and whether it was truly what they wanted. Kora's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "Inteus is already my papa. We're just making it so everyone else knows it too." The judge smiled at that, the first warmth he'd shown during the proceedings. After what felt like hours of deliberation, he delivered his ruling. The court finds that Inteus, currently known by single name but henceforth to be legally recognized as Inteus Hayes per his request, has demonstrated adequate fitness as a guardian and parent. The children known as Kora and Thomas, surnames unknown, are hereby legally adopted and shall carry the name Hayes. All rights and responsibilities of parenthood are granted. This adoption is final and binding. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Inteus felt something break open in his chest, some final wall he'd been holding in place for 8 years. He pulled both children close, and for the first time since losing his first family, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance at happiness. They returned to their valley as a legal family, arriving just as the first major storm of winter swept through. The cabin stood solid against the wind, smoke rising from the chimney, exactly as Inteus had built it to withstand whatever hardships came. That night, with the storm howling outside and the children sleeping peacefully in their loft, Inteus took out the journal Mary had given him and finally began to write. He wrote about finding Kora beside that overturned wagon, about Thomas emerging from the burning barn, about the slow process of building trust and home. He wrote about the community that had stood with him when he expected to stand alone. He wrote about the terror of almost losing everything and the overwhelming relief of the judge's final words. And he wrote about hope, that most dangerous and necessary of human emotions. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it came new challenges and new joys. Inteus taught the children to plant the garden, to recognize which plants were food and which were poison, to read the weather and understand the seasons. Thomas grew tall and confident, his tracking skills now rivaling Inteus's own. Kora learned to read fluently and began teaching Inteus things from books Mary sent, creating a strange and beautiful reversal of traditional education. They acquired chickens, then a milk cow, then 2 horses to help with the heavier work. The homestead grew and prospered, not wealthy by any standard, but sustainable, a genuine home carved from wilderness through effort and determination. Other families began settling in nearby valleys, drawn by reports of good land and good neighbors. Some were friendly, some kept their distance, but none challenged Inteus's right to be there or questioned his family's legitimacy. The adoption papers and the support of established community members like Hutchins had given them a legitimacy that couldn't easily be dismissed. 5 years passed in what felt like both an eternity and an instant. On the day Inteus filed the final paperwork to prove up his homestead claim, officially owning the land free and clear after 5 years of continuous residence and improvement, he stood with Kora and Thomas on the ridge overlooking their valley. Kora was 11 now, bright and curious and filled with questions about the world beyond their home. Thomas was 16, already as tall as Inteus and stronger, a young man rather than a boy. They'd grown up in this valley, and it had grown up around them, transformed from empty wilderness into a place where people lived and built and hoped. "Do you remember when we first came here?" Inteus asked. "I remember being scared," Kora said. "Everything was strange, and I thought you might leave us like everyone else had." "I remember thinking the cabin would never get finished," Thomas added. "It seemed impossible that we could actually build something real." Inteus smiled. "It seemed impossible to me too sometimes, but we did it anyway, because we're a family," Kora said. "Families do impossible things." That night, Inteus added a final entry to the journal that was now nearly full. He wrote about the homestead papers, about the children's growth, about the life they'd built together from nothing but determination and love. And he wrote the words he'd been unable to say for 8 years, the words that had seemed like betrayal to his first family, but now felt like honoring them. "I am happy. After everything lost, everything endured, I have found happiness again. Not the same as before, but real nonetheless. Kora and Thomas are my children, as much as if I'd been present at their births. This valley is my home, as much as my ancestral lands ever were. I am Inteus Hayes, father, homesteader, survivor. And that is enough." He closed the journal and looked around the cabin that had become a home. Kora was reading by lamplight, her lips moving slightly as she worked through a difficult passage. Thomas was repairing a harness, his hands steady and skilled. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across everything they'd built together. Outside, the valley lay quiet under stars that had witnessed countless lives and deaths and rebirths. Inteus had found Kora beside a trail, crying and alone, and in saving her, had somehow saved himself. He'd built a home, not just from logs and stone, but from choice and commitment, from showing up every day and doing the work of being present. He'd learned that family wasn't something you were born into, but something you created through loyalty and love, and the simple act of not walking away when things got difficult. The wooden horse Kora had clutched that first day sat on a shelf now, beside Thomas's father's pocket watch that had survived the fire, beside Inteus's own medicine bag from his Modoc heritage. Objects from different lives, different worlds, united in this single space that held them all. This was what it meant to build a home in the wilderness, not conquering the land, but finding a way to belong to it, not erasing the past, but carrying it forward into something new. And as the night deepened and the children eventually went to sleep, Inteus sat by the dying fire and felt at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new worries. But tonight, in this moment, they were safe. They were together. They were home. The valley had transformed in ways Inteus couldn't have imagined that first desperate winter. Where once stood a single rough cabin, now sat a proper homestead with whitewashed walls, glass windows that caught the morning sun, and a barn large enough to shelter 6 horses, 2 milk cows, and a growing flock of chickens. The garden that had started as hopeful rows of seeds now sprawled across a full acre, producing enough vegetables to feed the family through winter with surplus to trade at Hutchins's post. Split-rail fences marked boundaries and pastures, and a well-worn path connected their home to the creek where Kora still went each morning to fetch water. Though now she did it with practiced efficiency rather than fearful uncertainty. Thomas, now 13 and nearly as tall as Intius, worked alongside him constructing a smokehouse behind the main cabin, their movements synchronized from years of shared labor. Intius stepped back to examine their progress on the smokehouse foundation, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool autumn air. 2 years had etched new lines around his eyes and threaded more gray through his dark hair, but he moved with confident purpose now that he had something permanent to protect. "The corner posts need to be deeper," Thomas observed, crouching to examine their work. "Ground freeze is hard here. If we don't set them below the frost line, the whole structure will shift come spring." Intius smiled at the assessment, recognizing his own teachings reflected back at him. "You're right. We'll dig another foot before setting them permanently." In the distance, Kora's voice drifted across the meadow as she sang something she'd learned from Mary Hutchins. At nearly 8 years old now, she'd lost the haunted fragility that had characterized her those first months, replaced by sturdy confidence that came from knowing she was loved and safe. The sound of approaching horses broke their concentration. Intius recognized the riders cresting the ridge as Hutchins and Mary, along with Deputy Marshal Warren and Dr. Fletcher. Kora spotted them first and came running from the creek, her face bright with excitement at visitors. The group dismounted near the cabin, and Hutchins immediately pulled out an official-looking document. "Got something for you, Intius. Came through on yesterday's mail coach." Intius took the paper and unfolded it carefully. His eyes scanned the formal language, the territorial seal, the signatures at the bottom. It was the final certification of his homestead claim. 5 years of continuous residence and improvement, now complete. The land was his, legally and permanently. "Congratulations," Warren said, extending his hand. "You've earned every acre of it." Thomas and Kora crowded close to see the document, their faces reflecting pride and relief. This piece of paper meant security, meant no one could take their home away, meant everything they'd built together was protected by law. Mary pulled out a basket she'd brought. "Thought we'd celebrate properly. I baked a cake, and there's fresh butter from our dairy." They gathered around the table inside, the cabin that had once felt sparse now warm and lived in, filled with the accumulated evidence of family life. Books lined a shelf Thomas had built. Kora's drawings decorated one wall, and cooking implements hung neatly near the fireplace. As they ate cake and talked about harvest yields and winter preparations, Intius found himself reflecting on how far they'd come. 2 years ago, this table had held only 3 people bound together by trauma and necessity. Now it regularly accommodated friends, neighbors, a community that had formed around them despite his initial isolation. Dr. Fletcher raised his cup in toast. "To the Hayes family, may your roots grow deep and your future grow bright." The name still felt strange sometimes to Intius. This Hayes surname he'd adopted to make the legal paperwork simpler, but it had become part of their identity. Intius Hayes, Thomas Hayes, Kora Hayes, a family unit recognized and protected by the same government that had once tried to destroy his people. After the visitors departed, as evening painted the valley in shades of gold and purple, the 3 of them sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become a ritual, this quiet time together at day's end. "Papa," Kora said softly, "do you ever think about the day you found me?" "Sometimes. I was so scared. I thought everyone who mattered was gone forever." Thomas added, "I thought the same thing when you found me. Like the world had ended, and nothing good would ever happen again." Intius looked at both of them, these children who'd become his purpose and redemption. "I was scared too. I'd been alone so long I'd forgotten how to be part of something. You two taught me how to hope again. Do you think Mama and Papa would be happy I'm with you?" Kora asked. "I think they'd be grateful you're safe and loved. That's what parents want most." The conversation drifted to plans for the coming year. Thomas wanted to expand the horse herd, start breeding quality animals they could sell. Kora was determined to learn more advanced reading. maybe even help start a small school for the few other children now living in nearby valleys. Inteus listened to their dreams and ambitions, recognizing that he'd succeeded in giving them what mattered most, the confidence to imagine futures. That night, after the children had gone to sleep in their loft, Inteus took out the journal Mary had given him years ago. The pages were nearly full now, and he turned to one of the last blank spaces. He wrote simply, "Today we received the final homestead papers. The land is ours. But I've learned that ownership isn't what makes something home. Home is built through showing up every day, through keeping promises, through choosing love even when it's difficult. 2 years ago I found children who needed saving and discovered they saved me just as much. We built this home together, not just the structures, but the life inside them. Tomorrow Thomas wants to check the trapline he's set, and Kora has lessons to complete. I'll work on the smokehouse and prepare for winter. These ordinary tasks, repeated day after day, season after season, this is what family means. Not grand gestures, but steady presence. Not perfection, but persistence." He closed the journal and looked around the cabin. Kora's doll sat on a shelf next to Thomas's father's pocket watch that had survived the fire, next to Inteus's own medicine bag from his Modoc heritage. Objects from different lives, different worlds, united in this single space. Outside, the valley lay quiet under emerging stars. Somewhere out there were the graves of Kora's parents, of Thomas's family, of Inteus's own first wife and son. Loss had brought them all to this point, but it didn't define them anymore. What defined them now was what they'd chosen to build from that loss. Inteus stood and walked to the doorway, looking out at the land that had become theirs through work and commitment. The creek still ran silver in the moonlight. The meadow grass swayed in the evening breeze. The mountains stood eternal on the horizon. This valley had witnessed their transformation from broken individuals into a functioning family. It had absorbed their sweat and tears, their laughter and arguments, their failures and triumphs. And it had given them something priceless in return, a place to belong. He thought about that day 2 years ago when he'd heard crying on the trail, when he'd found a small girl clutching a wooden horse beside her dead parents. That moment had changed everything, had set in motion a series of events that transformed his entire existence. One choice, one decision to stop instead of riding past, had led to this life, this home, this family. "You're safe with me," he'd told Kora that first day. It had been a promise made without fully understanding its implications, a vow that had expanded to include Thomas, to include this homestead, to include a future he hadn't dared imagine. But he'd kept that promise. Through challenges and threats, through legal battles and physical hardship, through his own doubts and fears, he'd kept it. And in keeping it, he'd found redemption for all the promises he'd been unable to keep before. The wind carried the scent of pine and sage, the smell of home. Inside the cabin, the children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would come and their father would be there, as he'd been every day since finding them, as he would be every day until he couldn't be anymore. That was enough. That was everything. Inteus Hayes, former Modoc scout, survivor of wars and loss, had become something he'd never expected. A father, a homesteader, a man with roots deep enough to weather any storm. He returned inside and banked the fire for the night, then lay down on his bedroll near the hearth. The cabin settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure well built and well loved. Above, he could hear Kora's soft breathing and Thomas's occasional sleepy murmur. His family, his home, his second chance at a life worth living. As sleep claimed him, Inteus's last conscious thought was simple gratitude. Gratitude for the crying child who'd led him back to humanity, for the burning homestead that had given him a son, for the community that had stood with him when he'd expected to stand alone, for this valley that had become sacred through the investment of love and labor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new reasons to rise with the sun and face whatever came. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. 3 people who'd been lost had found each other and built something that would outlast them all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.